Hello again, and welcome back to the GMologist Presents RPG A Day 2021. And this won't be that small because I have a lot of call-ins from people who are very interested in what I have to say. I did not think that Game of Thrones would engender the response and reply from so many people. And just to be clear, while I did enjoy the first book, and early on in the season, I agree with most people that it gets old. And I will make some responses a little later on to some of the comments and call-ins. But we have call-ins from Barney Dicker and Arlen Walker coming up. And then I talk about what Small has reminded me of.
So, Carl, you played my message. We played a game. You talked about the game that I ran. So, I guess that's me just finding my way. Thank you very much to getting into your podcast. So it is. And you talk about flavour. And I think flavour is a really nice phrase. You know, it's tone. Tone is often talked about. I've talked about tone. Others have talked about tone. And what I like about flavour is that maybe tone and flavour are slightly different things. And I don't really know how or why, but it's nice to be able to have those two words in our vocabulary. Now, of course, I realise that flavour is the topic of RPG A Day month. So it's great that you're talking about it. It's great that everyone else is talking about it. It's great that we have flavour as another possible word, like I say. But Carl, I'm not going to call in to other people and tell them that I'm really pleased they're talking about flavour. I'm just going to say that I'm pleased that you're talking about flavours. That's that. See you. Bye.
Hey Barney, thanks for the call-in. And yes, it's super fun to play your games. I'm glad that you have alternate flavors in the types of games that you create and run. And I'd love to be a part of that table any day. So thanks again for the call, and we'll talk to you soon.
Hey, Carl, it's Arlen. I'm calling in about Joe Richter's message about Game of Thrones to say that Joe is absolutely fucking right, that Game of Thrones is super overrated. It is not a very good series, in my opinion. And there are a couple of kind of ways to point that out. One is that, you know what George Martin's comment on The Lord of the Rings is? He asks about what is Aragorn's tax policy after he becomes king, which is just a great summation of what's wrong with Game of Thrones, which is nobody gives a shit about Aragorn's tax policy except George Martin. And so who cares? But also, Game of Thrones isn't even the best book about those characters because there's Robert Irwin's Wonders Will Never Cease, which is a historical fantasy about the Wars of the Roses that the viewpoint character is the character that is the basis for Jaime Lannister, Anthony Woodville, the Lord Scales, whose sister marries Edward IV. Anyway, the point being that that book is way better. It's shorter than any of the Game of Thrones books are by themselves, so it's vastly shorter than the series, and it's way better than the whole thing as a whole. It's so good. It's like actually a legitimately like great, capital G, great book for fantasy, and it's super underrated. So anyway, read Wonders Will Never Cease instead of Game of Thrones because Game of Thrones is super overrated. That's my comment. Joe is definitely right. He's got it. You know, they're a chore to get through. There's so much stuff, and there's so much that's like really, I think, is supposed to come across as groundbreaking, but it's absolutely not. Like all the Tyrion stuff that is like, oh, look, it's somebody who is physically deformed, but they're not like, you know, that's not a reflection of their character and all that sort of stuff. And it's like, yeah, okay, I get that, but are you going to do anything like more interesting with him than that, or is it just going to be that metaphor over and over and over again? And yeah, that's what Game of Thrones is a couple of good ideas, and they got turned into a really big TV show because people like titties in their fantasy, and also because I think a lot of people who hadn't ever kind of seen something like it that would have been just fine with something equivalent. Like Game of Thrones is basically just Downton Abbey, but for dudes who want to see, people sword fight and dragons blow each other, fire at each other and all that sort of stuff. You know what I mean?
Hey, Arlen, thanks for the call-ins. Again, I am surprised that Game of Thrones generated so much, not controversy, but discussion, I guess, let's call it. And like Joe Richter, I agree that a great show, I don't know if it would be better, I wonder if it was an animated show or like a live action show, but the Malzahn Book of the Fallen would be a fantastic world to put a show in. I agree with you that there are better ways to tell the tale of the War of the Roses. And you mentioned a great one that I'm going to look up that I haven't read, but I have read a lot of the Philippa Gregory series on the Plantagenets and the Tudors, with basically the Daughter of the Rivers and the White Queen and the Red Queen and all of that, going back to Elizabeth Woodville, and then on down the line of the Plantagenets and Tudors. And Philippa Gregory does a great job of this very epic tale. It is historical fiction, and there have been shows on Stars, I believe. I know there's been White Queen and White Princess and Spanish Princess that are about those. And there's some really great acting, and I would say probably better than that which goes on in Game of Thrones. Very compelling from the film versions wise, and then the books are very good as well. So there you go. There are better things, we realize, but my point was that, look at the discussion that Game of Thrones has developed. People like it or they hate it. It did get a lot of promotion, and has put fantasy series on the map, whether you like it or not, I believe.
Hey, Carl, it's Arlen, starting the series of call-ins again because I lost my place. But basically what I wanted to mention was a sort of element of the culture around swords that I think is important for the discussion around swords and spears, which is to say that because swords are more expensive, that wearing a sword is a little bit like wearing heavy armor, in that it is a demonstration of wealth, which in pre-modern times generally means also the capacity to practice with that weapon, and be familiar with its use in a way that a farmer wouldn't. Excuse me. And so while swords might not always be the most effective weapon, especially if you're talking about a big shield wall where you want your spear to poke over the shield wall and that sort of stuff, I think it is fair to say that swords really are a signifier of martial ability that becomes significant in the same way that heavy armor for a lot of cultures or a lot of periods is a pretty significant indicator of not just somebody who's going to be hard to fight because their armor is effective, but also somebody who knows how to move in that armor because they have the time and the energy to practice with it because they're not spending their days tilling the fields and all that sort of stuff. So I think that's kind of an important cultural element too to talk about, that because swords become so associated with martial ability that, yes, a spear might be a more effective weapon in a lot of situations, but carrying a sword is a way to prevent violence at all, or to demonstrate capacity for violence, even if the carrier also has a spear, because we know that a lot of historical warriors would carry a spear or a polearm as sort of their main weapon and then a sword as a sidearm. And that, I think, is also one thing that a lot of RPGs are not very good at, that there's not really a sense of the idea, the way that, it takes years and years of practice to be really good at fighting with a specific weapon or in a specific style or something like that. It takes a long time to get really good, and, a lot of practice and a lot of practical experience. And that's just not something that a lot of RPGs, I think, model very well. You talk about like D&D style fighters that just pick up a bow and know how to shoot, and you go, but wait a second, it takes, years and years of practice to learn how to judge the alteration of the arrow, the way that, because you pull the arrow, the fletching back to the ear, not to the eye. And so you have to adjust for the slight variation there, at least with a longbow. So anyway, I guess my ultimate point is that if you were, sent back into medieval times through a malfunctioning time machine or something like that and couldn't get your way out, don't expect to be able to fight somebody with a sword just because you have a spear, because that person with the sword probably knows how to use the sword, whereas no guarantee of, a peasant with a spear actually having much ability beyond just sort of poking with it. So that's just as a sort of cultural thing that I think was not reflected in that discussion, and didn't necessarily need to be. The discussion was more about the kind of practical use of the weapon. But I think it is important to talk about that kind of cultural thing, because it partially also explains sort of the mystique around swords, that swords are associated with martial ability, and that's a sort of reflexive.
I'd love it when you call in, Arlen, especially about real world related things to our gaming hobby. I love your scholarly approach to many of these topics that we discuss, and I think it brings a lot of depth and interest, at least to me, and I'm sure to many, many others, about our game and how to make our narratives more exciting and realistic, which is a plus for me, and how to simulate better how the rules interpret the actions that we perform in these fantasy games. So a great series of calls, again, both for Game of Thrones and for the topic of weapons, swords specifically. And I will talk to you soon. Thanks again for the calls, Arlen. So this brings me to the topic of small, and I was really debating over what to talk about. I think I had initially wanted to talk about small as a descriptor in various incarnations of D&D, but I think I'm going to be a bit more specific based on the following quote: that even the smallest person in the world can change the course of history. And that is from Lady Galadriel, played by Kate Blanchett in the Lord of the Rings movie. And as many of us know the Lord of the Rings, we know that this is really a point where Frodo is feeling very despairing about the loss of some of the companions, especially while Gandalf had just passed away in Moria. They're recovering in Lothlorien. And Lady Galadriel encourages him with this quote. And as we know in the Lord of the Rings, it is Frodo and Bilbo who destroy the ring right at the end. So the small folk, the halflings, are the ones that do this. So that brings me to the topic of discussion about halflings. And I'm going to try to do this, and I don't want to go over long because I already have about 12 minutes worth of calls and responses. So let's look at halflings through the various incarnations of D&D. And I don't have OD&D. I don't think they were in there, but I could be mistaken. There are other better scholars of the history of our game than me, but I'm going to start with halflings in BX. And halflings in BX it's race as class, or species as class in this game. They do have restrictions. They can only advance to 8th level. They have special abilities, though, and they get a bonus to Dex They have this very controversial ability that I've seen put to use in the outdoors. They can seemingly vanish as well. And they have some prerequisites, but that's about it. So in BX, there are a few things. It's, again, and then when we get to AD&D, in BX, they also have a +1 to hit with missile weapons, so they're a bit more accurate. When we get to AD&D, there's more codification. It is race, and then you choose the class. In AD&D, halflings can only be fighters and only up to 6th level, but they can have a limited advancement as a thief. Now there's a little 6 in parentheses where druid is, and it does say in the notes that if it's in parentheses, they can only be NPCs. So, Then there are different sub-races of halflings. There are harefeet, tall fellows, and stouts, and it looks like they're limited in strength. That harefeet limited to strength under 17 and can only go up to 4th level, and tall fellows 17 and stouts 18 strength and can be 5th level, but tall fellows that have 18 strength can be 6th level. So there are a lot of restrictions on that. I don't know if I'm a big fan of that, but that's I'm just looking at the rules. They have a -1 to strength and a +1 to dex when you create the character. And then when we get down to the descriptions, what special abilities do they have? So like I said, in AD&D, halflings are a lot more codified. They do have a bonus to saving throws versus wands, staves, and rods. They do have generally a better stat line for saving throws in BX as well. They have resistance to poison. They can speak more languages. Certain halflings have infravision. So mixed blood have 30 feet, stouts up to 60 feet. And they do have this sort of passage notation since I guess they live underground. They can look at the downgrades, and they can determine directions. So they can move silently as well when they are by themselves. They do have like I said, a -1 to strength and a +1 to dex. So how does 2nd edition change that? In 2nd edition, things do not change much. They still have that -1 to strength and +1 to dex. That bonus to saves, BS on Constitution. They have that +1 bonus to attack rolls when thrown weapons and slings. So they codify that a little more. I don't remember if that was in AD&D 1. And then they have the same abilities, but they're reinterpreted based on any changes that were made in AD&D 2nd from 1st. So I honestly don't know what my point is yet. I'm trying to figure that out. And but in 3.5, I guess what I'm just trying to show is like how things have changed over the years with regards to halflings. And halflings, I guess, because of in 3.5, the +1, -1, I guess there's more of a range of target number for the D20 system. It's a +2 dex and -2 strength. It does codify small at this point. And as small creatures, the halflings get a +1 size to AC and attack rolls, and +4 to hide. But they use smaller weapons, and that could affect other things. They get some bonuses to certain skills, and that is a little different. Well, it's the same concept, but a little different from AD&D 1 and 2, where they have a bonus percentage to things like moving silently, but in this case it's also climb, jump, and listen. A +1 bonus to all saving throws, so I guess they maintain that luck or have morphed the Constitution bonus that they were getting against magic and poisons into this overall +1 saving throw. And they are good against fear, and they keep in the thrown weapons and slings. So it's pretty interesting that some things, I guess, have stayed the same. Some things have changed throughout the different incarnations. Now, what about I'm not going to talk about 4th. I'll just jump straight to 5th here. And in 5th, they did something where they don't have any negatives to your ability score. So dex goes up by 2. They have luck, which they can reroll, when they roll a 1 on the dice. They have an advantage to saving throws against frightened, so that has stayed the same from 3/5 to 5. And that's about it. They do have like a Lightfoot Halfling here in the SRD, and they also get a charisma bonus, and they're naturally stealthy. They can, you can hide when you're obscured by a creature that is larger than you. So, not as much, and they did get rid of the bonus to throwing things and slings, which is interesting, but kept the idea of them being lucky, and the dex bonuses all seem to be there, so they're quick and lucky, I guess, in 5th edition. There are subtle nuances in Pathfinder and 1 and 2, but I think they're pretty similar, if I recall correctly, to the way halflings are defined in 3.5. Another game that I like to play that has halflings is Warhammer Fantasy. So how does that compare? And in this case, I'm only going to talk about Warhammer Fantasy 4th, because there are different incarnations as well, and 4th is the one that I play. The other one that I played much is 2nd edition, and they do have halflings as well in there. And what I remember from that is that there are specific careers that halflings can go on. But here, when we look at something I do like, is that they drop that idea of race in Warhammer Fantasy and call these different humanoid species. So here, halfling species, when I look at the only thing that kind of can see how they're affected by mechanics really is when you get to the attributes, and generally speaking, it seems that only their strength and weapon skill is affected compared to humans being the baseline. But again, what's very interesting is that there is a bonus to their ballistic skill and dexterity and willpower and fellowship. So that charisma idea, that idea that they are strong-willed, good with throwing things or shooting things, and dexterous is pretty interesting. That they're all incarnations of various fantasy games, that concept is kept through. I think something that is kind of cool recently, though, that might set apart what game you want to play a halfling in, is that they just came out with a book called Archives of the Empire, and there are halfling badger riders, as well as field wardens, but badger rider, who does not want to ride a crazy badger as an armored halfling? So there you go, small halflings, big heroes in classic fantasy tales like Lord of the Rings, and very interesting that this brief little study shows that there are common concepts on how halflings are interpreted from AD&D, from BX to AD&D 1 and 2 to 3.5 to 5e, and then even a totally different game with a very different mechanic has the same kind of concepts as halflings. So there you go. Small heroes, but the smallest in the world. The smallest person in the world. What is it, the quote again? Do I have to re-record this? No. I will get the quote right. Even the smallest person in the world, even the smallest person can change the course of history. There you go. Not my best work. I'm sorry. I want to do this in one take. I don't want to redo it to get all my ums and foibles and pauses. So there you go. Small. RPG a Day 2021.